right. Hello, everybody, and welcome into a special interview edition of the PWTorch Fireside Chat. I'm PWTorch Assistant Editor Zack Heydorn. Thanks for watching. Thanks for being with me today. And with me today is a really special guest, freelance author of a recent Rita Chatterton, Vince McMahon piece from New York Magazine, Ms. Abe Riesman. Abe, it's a pleasure to have you here. Really excited to chat.
Thank you. I'm really glad that you had me on. And, the Torch was essential in my reporting. So it's nice to be invited on. Old editions. It was crazy how much detail there was in coverage of things in the past. So for all of your viewers and listeners, I recommend you explore the archives online. It's really fascinating stuff. Wrestling forgets its history so easily and readily. And there's so much rich stuff there. So anyway, it's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're here. And the piece was fantastic. Dropped on Monday. How's your life been since then?
Relatively, I was prepared for there to be some kind of major backlash, but to my pleasant surprise, people have been pretty receptive. It really in wrestling terms, it sort of got over. People really paid attention, and that's all I can ask for as a journalist, is that people pay attention to the important stuff in what I write. So it's been relatively straightforward, this response. Like it did pretty well, and it hasn't disrupted my life in some horrible way, but the response has been gratifying and interesting to watch. Because I say this research, I've been working on this book for over 2 years now. I should say the biography I'm writing of Vince McMahon, Ringmaster. And what's funny is in that time I didn't publish any wrestling journalism, and I hadn't done any before. My prior book was a biography of Stan Lee, the Marvel Comics figure. And prior to that, I had written a lot about the comics industry, among a million other things, but wrestling just hadn't been one of them. And so I was a little nervous because it's the first time I'd published anything in the wrestling vein. And, wrestling fans sort of have a reputation as being ruthless and detail-oriented, etc. But again, the response was really mostly just people paying attention. And so I'm very gratified by that.
That's really great. Where does your wrestling interest begin? Like, were you a fan? Like
I was. I forgive my cat. He's a little loud over here.
No problem. Tim, if you hear a screaming child, that's
great.
That's my situation. So you're good.
But when I was very young, doing the research actually allowed me to sort of forensically figure out when this must have been. Circa like 91, 92, when I was 6 or 7. I remember catching some WWF programming, not really like getting it. I was too young and wasn't really into it per se, but I remember being aware of it. And one thing I loved was Hogan ripping his shirt open. And I asked my mother if I could get a rip openable shirt. And she informed me that such things didn't exist, but God bless her. I love my mother. She took a shirt, cut down the middle, and then tied a little shoestring back and forth on the middle part so I could sort of pull it apart. It was great. But that wasn't real fandom. That was just sort of being aware of it and thinking it looked cool. It wasn't until like 1999. That was the other thing. I was able to figure out just from doing the historical research pretty much exactly when I started watching. In the spring of 1999, when I was 13, I started watching, and it was interesting because for the previous couple of years, since the dawn of what we now refer to as the Attitude Era, I'd been totally aware of what was going on in wrestling because you couldn't avoid it. I mean, if you were a millennial, I'm trans, but like at the time I was presenting as a boy. And if you were a millennial male, if you were seen as like a teenage boy in 1999, you were being marketed to, especially in America, and it was working. I mean, that it was a crazy popular time for wrestling. Not like I have to tell you that, but it's easy to forget just how massive it was, to the point where all of my bullies loved wrestling. They loved Steve Austin. So I hated him and I hated wrestling. I was like, I want nothing to do with this. This is what the people who torment me for being effeminate are constantly watching. Surely there's nothing in it for me. And then circa 1999 in the spring, my best friend caught some episode of Raw, I think, on television, and was like, this is the craziest stuff I've ever seen. And he sort of told me, you have to check this out. And I reluctantly gave it a shot. And the earliest episode I can remember, the specific memory I have of wrestling as a fan was, and I must have been watching before this, but the earliest one I have is watching the Raw right after Owen Hart died, the day after, which is a supremely weird first wrestling memory because it's
very weird.
It's one of the most, I mean, that's probably why it's the first memory. I'm sure I saw a lot of like solid wrestling programming before that, but that's the one where you're like, what am I watching? Like, this is the strangest thing I've ever seen. It's upsetting and weird, and it imprinted on my mind. I didn't even see Over the Edge where Owen died because I was still not at the stage where I was watching pay-per-views. I was just catching stuff for free. And after that, I was hooked. It wasn't necessarily because of that Raw, but around then, the other specific memory I have from early wrestling is, again, this sort of weird moment that is not much celebrated. But I vividly remember watching the Raw where Vince revealed himself as the greater power / higher power. You know, they can never get the naming straight. The endless storyline that they didn't plan ahead for and didn't know who was going to be the identity. I remember watching. And the thing is, I think if you were, unlike me, a regular viewer going back a few years, you must have found that reveal to be very disappointing because it's like Vince had been a heel. He'd done a face turn. This was, you know, the most boring possible choice you could make. Was like, it turns out it was Vince. It also didn't make any sense, right? Because he, you know, this character had been tormenting Vince. But I hadn't been watching long enough. So for me, it was totally thrilling. It was I had watched Vince being a face and just sort of thought of him that way because that was what was going on in the storyline when I tuned in. So then to see him do this reversal and to do it in such a, I mean, it's not so much the reversal, it's just the way it was presented. So dramatic. It was so interesting, just visually and auditorially. I mean, the way Vince said, it was me, Austin, it was me all along, was so visceral. You know, and I remember watching that, and that was really the moment when I was hooked.
And then you get like, so you and I both are, you know,
in the millennial bracket.
Yes, in the Attitude Era, being kind of like
we're kids of the Attitude Era. Yeah,
kids of the Attitude Era. And the thing is, like, what I like about that angle in particular is what you mentioned. I mean, it is a visceral kind of reveal, but also you get like immediate like gratification on the other side with the big Austin pop, the Austin like, hey, he's like it's just so, in a lot of ways, it's like it exemplifies like the chaos of the Attitude Era.
Yes,
but it was also just really compelling TV too.
It was, and after that, I fell into this like 3-year stretch where I was really into wrestling. I got so addicted to it. It was all I talked about with my friends. And what was really interesting, not to make it too much about me, was this was this period when, like I said, you know, the people who were bullying me loved wrestling. And that didn't stop when I started watching wrestling. It was common ground with my bullies, which at the time seemed like a good thing. And now in retrospect is much more complicated in my mind because I was sort of learning how you were supposed to be a guy at the end of the millennium. And the Attitude Era didn't have the best, healthiest ideas about what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman or any of that. You know, the Attitude Era, I really feel is totally fascinating television that needs to be examined, but it wasn't, you know, progressive. It was transgressive. And that was really appealing to me. But in retrospect, it was really interesting. It gave me a lot of really weird, kind of bad ideas, but it was so compelling. You couldn't take your eyes off of it. You know, and then I fell off like many of our cohort generationally after the WCW purchase. I remember that happening and being like, this is the beginning of the golden era, right? Like this is going to be all the things rolled up into one. And then it just sort of fizzles. You know, you have the invasion storyline, and it kind of, I remember just finding it boring and kind of dropping off with it.
You're not the only one.
I know
Not
I'm
the
not the
only
only
one.
one.
Yeah.
Exactly. I dropped off, and then for about 20 years, I wasn't really paying attention to wrestling. I it's in the culture. So like I knew who John Cena was, I knew who Dave Bautista was, like these figures who'd really crossed over, I was still aware of, even if I wasn't specifically tracking them. But it wasn't until I had turned in the Stan Lee book and was thus prompted to start thinking about what my next book would be that I had a conversation with my wonderful spouse, who is also a journalist and editor, and we were just brainstorming, and neither of us can remember who first suggested the idea of a biography of Vince McMahon, but as soon as it came up, we were both like, that's the one. That it hasn't been done in that kind of way, and it's just a story that is both compelling on its own and sort of needs to be told in a lot of ways. So that
Absolutely.
was sort of how I fell back into it.
Yeah. So okay, let's talk about that. So you have the McMahon book coming out early next year, right? I believe
Mhm.
March.
The
And
Tuesday before WrestleMania. Not
Tuesday.
only one person is on Twitter did the math on that. I didn't want to point it out, but it comes out on March 28th. So
Okay, there you
it's
go.
going to be pretty wild timing. That was actually accidental. It was going to be this fall, but due to supply chain issues, which are plaguing publishing, it got bumped to next year. But as soon, they picked a date kind of arbitrarily. And my editor calls me up and goes, "It's the Tuesday before WrestleMania." Like it wasn't even
Not
the
going to turn
plan.
that down. Yeah.
It it
Yeah.
it it works. So yes.
That
Anyway, sorry, I
works.
interrupted you, but it's coming out next
No,
week.
no. That's great. And so, you kind of mentioned already like how the book came to light.
Mhm.
But this piece in particular, the piece that was published Monday in New York Magazine, Rita
Mhm.
Chatterton, the allegations of rape against Vince McMahon.
Mhm.
Um, did this article, this piece, come from kind of like the book?
Book.
And
Yes. 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 I had you know look, the Rita Chatterton allegation was not new per se. Wrestling forgets its history very easily, and it had sort of been buried, but it was out there. That was one of the first things that when I started doing research into Vince that you learn about.
Mhm.
It's not brought up all the time, but like it's when you're digging into Vince, that's one of the things that starts to get whispered about. So from a very early stage of the book, I tried to find Rita. Um, I did a lot of work trying to track her down. And then, long story short, and it is somewhat of a long story, she did this appearance at the International Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame, which is run by this guy named Seth Turner, last August, I believe it was. No one talked about it. Like it was this fascinating thing in that it turned, as I learned later, Seth had been friends with Rita's daughter and had asked her to sort of asked Rita to come back and kind of, receive this award, this Trailblazer award. And Rita was really reluctant, but she did. And Brian Solomon, actually, the wrestling journalist who just put out a biography of the Sheik, he had been there and took a photo on his phone. He was just like, wow, Rita Marie is here. And I found that through like a reverse Google image search. It was sort of weird and haphazard, but I found that tweet and then contacted Brian, and Brian put me in touch with Seth,
Mhm.
the guy who runs the Hall of Fame. And I initially thought I was just going to talk to Seth. Seth was willing to talk to me. Rita was reluctant. So I interviewed Seth, and that probably would have been enough because it was still adding texture and perspective. But then I get a message from Seth saying, Rita's going to be at this convention in Connecticut this was a few months ago, and she'll be there between like 10:30 and 12. I leave you to do with that information what you will. So I bought an Amtrak ticket. I went to Connecticut. I went to this little convention, and sure enough, there she was,
Wow.
working the table. And I talked to her and struck up a conversation, told her what I was interested in doing and that I was writing this book. At the time, I didn't have a plan to turn it into a spin-off article. I just wanted it for the book. And to my surprise, and it was a good thing, she said, she wrote her phone number on a piece of paper and said, don't give this to anybody, but give me a call. I'm free in the evenings. So I called her, and I thought it would just be an initial sort of off the record conversation, or she'd be reluctant, but she really just went for it. It was a story that she wanted to tell. and was ready to tell. And it's a story that's not, one of the things I told her, and this is just sort of how journalism ideally, I think, should work, was I told her this is not just a story about the allegation. Obviously, that's the thing that everybody picks up on.
Mm-hmm.
But I really want it to be a profile of her. And obviously, the allegation is a core component of her career. But like, she was a trailblazer. It was remarkable to be a female WWF referee, and it wasn't easy. There were stories that didn't make it in there that are not necessarily scandalous allegations, but it was kind of crappy to be a woman in wrestling. That's not news to anybody, but like she really had kind of a rough go of it. And that makes it interesting. She was a trailblazer. She struggled. And I wanted to tell her story and not just the story of how she intersected with Vince McMahon's story.
Do you get the sense? Did you get the sense talking with her that, well, first maybe give some just general thoughts on what it was like for you talking to her, but also did she have like a fond perspective on her time in wrestling at this point?
Some things. She made two good friends at WWF, according to her. Leonard Inzitari, who was known as Mario Mancini, who I quote extensively in the article. And the other was Andre the Giant. According to her, she and Andre were very close, or at least as close as she got to anybody in wrestling. She told, she has a whole funny story about how he didn't like her initially, and then they got to be friends. And she remembers Andre fondly. She remembers the thrill of being in the ring fondly. I mean, one of the core motifs of the Rev Ringmaster is just ring addiction. Once you've had that magic of being in the ring for an actual pro wrestling match, for a lot of people, like that's it. You're in forever, or like part of you is going to be in forever, even if you try to extricate yourself. It's just something that matters that much to you and that feels that good. And she really felt that way. I mean, she talked about doing her first televised match, which was at Madison Square Garden, which is crazy. She'd only done these like small shows. And then likely because Vince was pushing this sort of women's lib angle in the Cyndi Lauper, Wendy Richter period, that's when apparently he calls Rita and says, do you want to do the show at MSG? And we want to push you. And she loved a lot of that. Being in the ring was something that was really gratifying to her. And it really hurt and sucked when she had to walk away from that for her, because it's hard to pull away from that. And
when you were able to talk to her, I mean, did she point you to Mario?
Atari, yes.
Yeah.
She did. She said that he was a good friend and that he might be willing to talk, and that more importantly, she said that she had told him what had happened. And that, as a journalist, you're like, okay, well, contemporary corroboration is key in stories like this. No, she doesn't claim anybody witnessed the incident. In fact, she says Jim Stewart, the late limo driver of Vince McMahon, had left the vehicle when the alleged incident happened. But according to her, she spoke to Inzitari, to Mario Mancini, not long after. So she gave me his phone number, and I called him up. And again, to my surprise and delight, delight's a strong word, I don't mean that, but surprise, he was willing to talk, and pretty readily. I mean, I include this quote in there, but he's carried water for Vince a lot. Mario Mancini is not a name like David Schultz or any number of other people who like are classically known as being disgruntled and angry at Vince. So it meant something when he goes, I can't do this anymore. I can't remember the exact quote, but he said something along the lines of, I can't keep defending Vince after the Wall Street Journal thing had come out. I'm sorry, I skipped a step there. I'd done the initial interview with Rita for the book, and then when the Wall Street Journal allegations came out a couple of weeks ago, I just thought, it's now or never. That there should be an article talking about Rita.
Yeah.
And I have the material, so I contacted my editor at New York Magazine, who's great, Ryu Speff, and I just said, I think I've got something. And it was relatively easy to write because I had all the material, or a lot of the material. But the Inzutari thing was new. I'm really glad that happened because now I get to put that in the book as well. The book is luckily was not completely finalized copies, so I can put in some of his corroboration. But
that's a key piece that was missing from. I don't want to say
no, I get what
missing,
you
but
mean. It was something
never
that wasn't there before that
right.
would have changed the calculus at the time.
Yes, and the quote was, because I want to get into this a little bit. He says he's and Vince McMahon dug himself such a deep hole that I'm just tired of it. I can't do it anymore. That was the quote from the piece. What kind of sense, either from him or from your conversations with Chatterton, like that is a common theme of like, well, I'm going to protect my spot. I'm going to protect like my place in the company. And Vince McMahon has held, so much power as far as that goes. Were you able to get any insight into like the psychology of that, of like not like knowing what's right and what's wrong,
but then
feeling like you can't do anything, feeling a little trapped?
Well, let me tell you, I didn't need new insight into that because that's the process of this whole book. There have been so many people who I've talked to a lot of people, don't get me wrong. I did more than 150 interviews for this book, but there were a lot of people who didn't want to talk to me because, look, the phrase that you always come back to, and I bring it up a lot in the book, is protect the business. You're taught at a very early stage when you're a wrestler, protect the business. Even if that doesn't mean protecting old style kayfabe, which is what it used to mean,
right?
It still means you don't rock the boat because there's this real perception of fragility, not just in your career, but in the whole edifice of wrestling. And the fact is, when you're protecting the business, for about 20 years, Vince just was the business. Like there were other promotions, but nothing anywhere near the scale of WWE. And that's still true. AEW has made great strides, but WWE is this multimedia empire. It's worth a lot of money. It's, and when Vince is the business, if your dedication is to the business and protecting the business, you protect Vince. There's so many people who have said this to me. Just if I talk out against Vince, it's not going to be great for my career, or I'm not going to be able to be in the Hall of Fame, or I might need, action figure royalty sharing and I can't, whatever. It's common. And so this story was just sort of another example of that.
Do you, in talking to those folks,
it's okay. Sorry. It's no big deal. Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
No. In talking to those folks and throughout your interviews, I mean, were you able to kind of get a sense of like, I'm really just fascinated with the psychology of getting out of that, because some people do.
Some people do.
And like, Mario, of course, I mean, just did, when he's talking to you and finally kind of lets this go, were you able to kind of digest that process with some of your interviews?
Sure. Yeah. There were people who spoke to me who had not spoken about this stuff before, or like Mario, Lenny had carried water for Vince plenty of times. And part of your job as a journalist is getting people to feel comfortable telling the truth, or at least the truth as best they know. And, I don't want to name names just yet, but I was able to speak to a lot of people who had not spoken at length about this. And part of that, I think, is no knock on the Torch at all, but coming from outside wrestling journalism helped a lot in that regard. I'm very lucky and privileged in that I'm coming into wrestling journalism laterally. Like I already had an established career and track record writing about other things. So it was, I had the ability to sort of say, look, I've already written a book. I've written a lot of articles, and people were willing to, not everybody, but I think a lot of people were willing to take that seriously in a way that was very helpful, and breaking out of that, it's hard. You're taking a risk if you're a wrestler or some other sort of wrestling personality, but you try and make people feel comfortable and let them know that you're an ethical person and you're not going to abuse their trust. And then you take it from there. You know, I mean,
Yeah.
there's no simple formula for it.
Was there
It's
any was there any other kind of like glaring, because like you said, the story with of Rita is out there. If
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
out there, it's, I think, got a brighter light on it right now, given your piece and given the other stuff going on with Vince McMahon, which we'll get into in a minute. But did anything else stand out in your conversations with Rita as far as something that just impacted you, whether it's about her or
Hmm.
whether it's about Vince McMahon or the
I
wrestling
think,
industry in general?
I don't know. It's I mean, certainly putting the story out has impacted the way I'm approaching this topic because, like I said, I didn't have the interview with Leonard and Zatari prior
Mhm.
to this article. So that really helped with that. But also it just the fact that there was such a robust response and it wasn't me getting shouted down gives me hope that the book will be something that people pay attention to. Obviously, it's a longer thing, and who knows how many people buy books these days. But I think the biggest impact was giving me a sense that, like, I think people are ready to listen to this stuff. I
Yeah.
think there's a critical mass of people who are thinking about Vince or have thought about Vince. I mean, that's the other thing is there's the wrestling fans who I'm going to hopefully be able to get to buy the book, but there's a lot of people who were wrestling fans and are no longer, but vividly remember things like the higher power reveal. I mean,
Right.
there are all these people who watch wrestling in at either of Vince's two big spikes, the 80s, mid 80s into, and then the late 90s into the new millennium. These periods of massive popularity, they have a legacy. There are a lot of people out there who know about Vince McMahon, but don't really know about Vince McMahon. I mean, that's pretty much everybody. There was so much stuff that was out there, and yet so much more that hadn't been explored. So much more that hadn't been explored or hadn't been collated. There was a lot of stuff that was out there, but because his life is so dense with events and narrative and meaning and characters, there are a lot of times when you don't realize that things are happening at the same time because you're telling the story of some other thread in wrestling and it involves Vince. Like the fact that, the Jimmy Snuka case with Nancy Argentina was happening right when Vince was about to start making the final payment on the series of 4 payments he was doing with his father and the other owners of the
Hmm.
WWF to get control of it. So it's literally, weeks and days before he's supposed to make this final payment. As it turns out from my research, he had a very complicated relationship with his dad, much more complicated than he ever alluded to before, at least in public. And, that coincidence is a perfect example where you go, once you start doing the math, you realize this life has been so busy. I mean,
Yeah.
from 1982, when he makes that first payment on the company onward, it's just every minute for him, he has more happen to him than most people have in a lifetime. And that, I can't even remember what your question was now, but
No.
that was part of what I was trying to do, was uncover new stuff, but also just sort of, synthesize what was out there already and kind of paint a more full picture.
Yeah, fascinating. So Vince McMahon, let's spend some
Yes.
time talking about him. Um, you mentioned a complicated relationship with his father.
Yeah.
Maybe if you can maybe just shine a
I can
little bit
tease a
more
little
detail.
bit of that. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I say complicated because it is. It's not just, there are a lot of wrestlers who, and just people who had sort of had, abusive relationships with their parents, and that influences a lot or whatever. And with Vince's dad, with Vince Sr., which of course he's not actually Senior because he had a different middle name, but we'll call him Vince Sr. because everybody else does. Vince, again, this is public record. Vince didn't meet his dad until he was 12.
Mhm.
There's this 12-year span of Vince's life, these extremely formative years when Vince Sr. is just not there. And he's getting raised in semi-rural poverty in North Carolina by his mother and his stepfather, and about whom he had many negative things to say later. And then he meets his dad, and the story sort of goes from there, but it's complicated because they I'm debating how much I should give away, but suffice it to say, there was a way in which Vince couldn't access his father through family means, couldn't access the love of his father in some ways. And again, he said this, he said his father never told him he loved him until the last time that Vince saw him when Vince Sr. was dying. And he said it one time. That's Vince's own admission. He couldn't access that I love you in that context. So he starts engaging with his dad in a business context. There's no evidence. Vince has never said that he even watched wrestling prior to meeting his dad at 12. Jim Crockett Productions was putting on stuff in North Carolina, but there's no indication that Vince was even watching it. It really was, He met his dad. His dad was a wrestling promoter, and he wanted to get close to his dad. And the only way he could really do that was through the business. And so he became this wrestling head. And, there's a lot more there, but that's a complicated relationship where you're trying to access a father through a professional relationship. That can be fraught. So I'll leave it at that. But it's there's a lot to dig into when it comes to the personal relationships. This book, I hope appeals to people because it's not just a brick by brick, here's how the business developed thing. There are plenty of books like that, and they're really vital. I mean, I would be nowhere without them. Tim Hornbaker, all these people. Mm-hmm. But this is much more of a psychological story. It's investigative, but the book is very much a story of, it's kind of, in a lot of ways, it's Mr. McMahon Begins, like Batman Begins. It's about how the character of Mr. McMahon got constructed and what the materials that went into that character were, what the raw materials were. And, it's Mr. McMahon, which of course is the persona that Vince appeared on after the Wall Street Journal allegations came out. He comes out and does this address to the WWE universe, and it's explicitly in character. Right. This is Mr. McMahon,
and promoted that way too.
It promoted that way. It was Mr. McMahon will address the WWE universe on SmackDown at 8 p.m. Eastern. And one of my theses with this book is, in the form of Mr. McMahon, Vince created an armor that is virtue proof. You can't virtue at him. You can't just say, hey, you're being a bad guy, because the whole point of Mr. McMahon is that he is a bad guy. This is how Vince has operated, is you lob allegations at him, and it kind of rolls off because there's this, it's similar to his good friend Donald Trump. You go, well, what did you expect? That was a big response. That the closest thing I got to backlash for the Rita Chatterton article was people saying, well, this is no surprise, or this is old news, or whatever. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Vince has built this persona that people associate with bad deeds. And that's not me being libelous. I'm talking about Mr. McMahon. We've all watched wrestling.
Yeah.
Mr. McMahon is a character that does bad things to people. And that's what you expect. So there's no surprise when an allegation comes up for a lot of people. There's no sense of, wow, this completely contradicts my sense of who this person was. You go, well, old news, or well, that's just how it works. And that's a really powerful tool. There are people who figured that out after Vince, but Vince was, and especially in politics, but Vince was a real pioneer in that regard. He figured out how to create an expectation that bad things will happen or be revealed or whatever. And then when they happen, people go, well, that was what I was expecting.
Yeah. I think, look, a lot of the allegations that are current, as far as hush money payments and the WWE board investigation, Wall Street Journal article, they're
serious allegations.
Right. Very serious stuff. The Rita Chatterton story, I mean, incredibly serious. And it's good that it's getting that a renewed kind of focus. The root of a lot of that, I think, is, power, and Vince McMahon not only wanting to keep power, but just having a lot of it. Because I think
Oh yeah.
an interesting piece of this puzzle, to me anyway, is the psychology of Vince McMahon. Like, look, he operated, I don't want to say in the shadows, but pro wrestling was always kind of in the shadows. So he was
It
this
was
really
marginal.
powerful, bombastic figure. But now, though, now that he's not that anymore. Now they're
They're a big
this big
corporate
corporate
entity. It's
thing,
not.
and they've got licensing partners and they've got television
Mhm,
deals. And
mhm.
so, he worked so hard to get out of the shadows and the smoke filled,
Yeah, yeah,
buildings
yeah.
with
Just the way
wrestling.
wrestling used to be. Yeah.
And now he's there and more exposed than ever. And that power is kind of on the line in certain ways.
Maybe it
I
is,
mean,
maybe it isn't. I mean, that's the thing. It's like the announcement after the allegations came out from the Wall Street Journal article was, Vince McMahon is stepping back, which is a weird verb. What does that mean? Stepping back as chairman and CEO, and Stephanie's going to take over as interim chairman and CEO. And what does that mean? And then the big tell was, but Vince will retain control over creative. Well, that's mainly what Vince does. I mean, that's a huge portion of his day is creating and approving and denying creative. So it's
yeah.
like, well, if he's still doing that, then what exactly was taken away? It's a little ambiguous right now. I don't know where it's going to end up. It's really hard to do Kremlinology, as they say, when it comes to WWE, because they run a pretty tight ship these days. The farther back you get, the easier it is to talk to people, because there were people from that smoke-filled room era, and a lot of them feel like they owe Vince something, but not everything, because they started in one of the territories. They started elsewhere or before him. But the closer you get to the present, the average wrestler who's in WWE, their career was kind of made by Vince. Under Vince's purview, that's where they flourished. And I don't know how many consequences he's going to face for the Wall Street Journal allegations. I'm watching along with everybody else. I'm doing research and reporting as well, but a lot of it's just going to come down to, no matter how much reporting I did, that doesn't mean I get to be on the WWE board and, decide what happens to this person. And I don't know what's going to happen. It's a Dave Meltzer made some comment about how I would have to rewrite the last 10% of the book. And what's weird is I've added stuff, but I don't think I've had to rewrite it, because you'll see thematically the linkages, and you'll see that even if these allegations don't turn out to be completely borne out, it's part of a pattern of allegations. These are
And
things
them not sticking.
and them not sticking. Exactly. I think people who read the book will see the allegations in a different perspective, the hush money allegations, as opposed to going, well, this doesn't square with the guy I read about. I think it's going to be, you get a better sense of where all this is coming from.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No. So a couple more questions for you here. Really,
Sure.
two more.
Mhm.
What did you learn about Vince McMahon that you didn't
Oh,
know?
so
Either
much.
from right. I didn't know. I don't mean like little minor
No, I
details,
know,
but
but
were
yeah,
you able to get a sense of like who
what
this guy
drives
is?
him? Yeah.
Is this guy like this really bad, predator,
I
a
don't want to put labels
manipulator?
on it like that, but what I've learned is Vince. There's a lot of stuff. I'm trying to think of one of the most concise ways I can put it, but let me put it this way, not to make it all about me, but it's no coincidence that I sort of figured out I was trans and decided to move to the she her end of the spectrum around the time I was finishing this book, because Vince is a fascinating study in American masculinity, both in his own persona and in the personas that he's fostered. I've learned that there's a real longing in him for more, for more. And again, I'm sort of picking my words carefully, because I don't want to, I have to sell the book to a certain extent, but he's somebody who has an unending desire to win. And I don't even have that. That was one of the things, that's why I mentioned the being trans part. Finishing it, I sort of went, this kind of masculinity is fascinating to me, and I think very important to document and analyze, but I kind of didn't want any part of it anymore. There was this aspect of the machismo that comes in wrestling that I went, it has its purposes, and I'm not necessarily dissing anyone on an individual level, but like, I kind of don't want to, I want to divest from that a little bit. And, Vince has a lot of masculinity damage. He's somebody who, like a lot of us, grew up with expectations about what it means to be a man and what it means to have a relationship with your dad, and to have a relationship with your mom, all of this stuff. And I think it really had an effect on him. I think there's a lot of theatrical masculinity that comes out of him that needs to be interrogated. And read the book, and if I could summarize it easily, I would, but it sort of takes the whole arc of the book to let you get a sense of, okay, this is how you go from being poor boy in North Carolina without a dad to being sort of the ultimate dad. He becomes this kind of nightmare, again, in the context of the storyline. He becomes this sort of nightmarish father figure, both literally when he's having problems with Stephanie or Shane and in the ring or whatever, but also just figuratively. You talk to wrestlers and they will tell you, I had in these words, they'll say he was like a father to me, or we had this real father-son relationship. And that was just completely fascinating to me. Here's this kid who didn't have a dad, had a stepdad who, according to Vince, was very abusive. And he goes on to become a dad, and not just to his kids. And that arc of his masculine journey, I think, is something that really appealed to me and I found fascinating, and I think is instructive as an object lesson for a lot more than just wrestling.
Is Vince McMahon a bad person?
I can't, this is what I said about my Stan Lee book. It's all about the fact that there's horrible ambiguity about what makes a person good or bad. You can't pin it down in words like that. Let me put it this way. He created a persona that can do bad things. And whether that, I'll leave it sort of open-ended in that way, but he created a persona, like I said, where people expect him to do bad things. And whether that makes him a bad man, not to cop out too much, but I don't think that that's really a question that a journalist can answer. Mm-hmm. But he did build this edifice in the form of Mr. McMahon and kind of his public persona, which, merged with Mr. McMahon.
So let me ask you a quick other question about that.
No, go ahead.
Was it in your eyes and through your research, was it a calculated creation? Like, I'm going to create this persona of Vince McMahon so that I can do whatever I want and assume all this power, or was it just kind of on accident?
There are kind of two schools of thought among McMahonologists, which is there's sort of the early McMahonists and the late McMahonists, where it's like, there are people who say, including WWE, like, Mr. McMahon was born right after the Montreal Screwjob, and here comes this character coming straight out of this particular incident. I'm an early McMahon. That's like late McMahonism, where like it only pops up in 97, 98. I'm a firm believer that Mr. McMahon as a character, you have pieces of that getting put into place as early as 1987. For me, the first real appearance of what becomes Mr. McMahon is when he performs that song Stand Back that was written for him at the 1987 Slammies. He comes and does this performance, and we sort of take it for granted now. We're like, oh, this is this goofy thing Vince did. It was completely weird at the time. He was just an announcer. He's not, he wasn't just an announcer, he was the owner, but like in the public persona,
right,
he was just an announcer. And he comes out and does this wild song about destroying his enemies. That's what Stand Back is. No, everyone sort of doesn't pay attention to it, but it's this silly little song about destroying everything and being number one. And for me, that's the beginning. And then you have pieces that just come into place throughout. You have him going to USWA, to Memphis. in 1993 and doing this heel turn, which, you know, outside of Memphis, no one really knew about, but within Memphis, it's electrifying. You know, you have in his, you know, part of the Mr. McMahon persona comes out of like being in the steroid trial, getting investigated by the DOJ and winning. And you see him give, you know, basically cut promos after he wins against the Justice Department, where he's like, the hunters will become the hunted. And, you know, gentlemen, is that the best you can do? These are direct quotes from addresses he did in one form or another that were ostensibly nonfiction, but you see the beginnings, or at that point, just the development, the continuations of this persona that later gets a name as Mr. McMahon. But I don't think it was a deliberate attempt to go, well, I'm going to create something that gives me impunity. I think it developed gradually over time, but it did, you know, and now it's this fact of life.
Interesting. All right, let's wrap up here with Rita Chatterton. I think it's like, this is, you know, the New York Magazine piece was about her story, and, you know, about not just about the allegations, but as you mentioned in the piece, like her, you know, not wanting to be forgotten, right? Like, and so I think it's important to note just the, you know, the bravery then to talk about these allegations against somebody so powerful, but also now to revisit that after so long has gone on and so much has happened with him, and nothing happening to address that issue. I find that just to be incredibly
it was
brave.
she was really brave to come forward. You know, it's whatever you think of the allegation, she's only opening herself up to problems right now, you know, and that's what happens whenever anybody comes forward, especially women. And, you know, thank God Rita's not on social media, I guess. You know, she hasn't gotten brigaded in that way, but she was taking a lot of risk. She got sued last time she came forward. You know, in 1993, there was this lawsuit against her and Geraldo, and, you know, she'd appeared on the Geraldo Rivera show to make the allegation, all this stuff. So she was taking a risk, and I don't take that lightly. I really, it was an act of trust for her to tell me this stuff, and I hope I didn't abuse that trust.
Abe, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Thank
and
you.
Again, the piece took not only it did take guts from Rita, but from you too, to put it out and put it out the way that you did. I thought it was well written. Thank you for your time today, and good luck with the book, March 28th, 2023.
March 28th. I'm obligated to tell you, you should go to my website to get the link so you can go pre-order. If you go to abrahamriesman.com, you know, I'm going by Abe most of the time, but Abraham is sort of the brand still, at least as of now. So if you just go to abrahamriesman.com, you'll find a link to pre-order right there.
Fantastic. And where can people follow you on social media to read?
At Abraham Joseph on Twitter. I spend far too much time there, so you'll get plenty of content.
Don't we all?
Don't we all?
Abe,
thank you so much, Zach.
Very much.
This was a real pleasure.
Yeah, a pleasure to have you too. And we'll talk again soon.